Imagine for a moment the metallic sound of chains dragging on the ground, the cold weight of iron locked around ankles, and the silence broken only by screams of pain. For centuries of slavery, men, women, and even children were subjected to instruments of punishment so cruel that the mere memory of them still sends shivers down the skin today. Chains, hooks, iron collars, wooden stocks, and whips were not just objects, but symbols of humiliation, control, and spilled blood. Each piece of iron, each piece of wood hardened by time, carried within it the mark of oppression and the violence that sustained one of the most inhuman systems in history. But this video is not only about pain, it is about memory. By learning about the instruments that turned the lives of the enslaved into fields of suffering, we also understand the importance of valuing the freedom we have today. It is about reflecting, about not allowing the past to be erased, and about recognizing that the pain of our ancestors must be remembered so that it will never be repeated again. In the next few minutes, you will discover the most feared punishments of slavery, how they worked, what effects they had on the body and mind, and why even today they speak to us about power, resistance, and humanity. Prepare yourself to hear stories you may have never heard before, but that must be told. Because while iron rusted and wood rotted, the memory of slavery remains alive, and it is this memory that will guide our journey from now on. The iron chains were perhaps the most cruel and silent symbol of slavery. They did not need screams or constant whippings. The sheer weight of the iron was already enough to remind the enslaved of their condition. Shackles on the ankles, handcuffs on the wrists, iron collars around the neck. They were devices designed to imprison not only the body, but also the mind, transmitting the feeling that there was no possible escape. The metallic sound dragging along the floors of slave quarters and plantations was the anthem of oppression, reminding at every step that freedom had been torn away. These chains were manufactured in colonial workshops or imported from Europe, and they had one direct purpose: control. The heavy iron prevented escapes, reduced agility, and caused constant wounds. On slave ships during the crossing of the Atlantic, thousands of Africans were chained in rows, often lying side by side, with no room to move. Ankles bled, wrists swelled, and open wounds became infected quickly. The smell of rust mixed with sweat and blood created an unbearable environment, where pain was as constant as thirst and hunger. Inside the slave quarters, the chains remained present. Some enslaved people slept chained to walls or columns, prevented even from changing position during the night. Rest was a torment. The cold iron cut into the skin, and the weight kept the body from relaxing. Over time, deep wounds appeared, turning into permanent scars. Many carried marks that never completely healed, signs engraved on the body by the violence of the slave system. It was as if the iron wanted to write on the victim's skin the eternal reminder of their condition. Beyond physical pain, there was psychological suffering. To be chained meant being reduced to the condition of an object, treated as merchandise without even the right to move freely. Slavery manifested there in its most brutal form, the human transformed into a thing, the spirit suffocated by the weight of iron. Many described the chains as steel serpents wrapped around their bodies to drain not only blood, but dignity itself. The metallic sound became a constant music, reminding them that escape was nearly impossible, that hope had to be hidden in the silence of the heart. Chains also served as a collective warning. By capturing a runaway slave and exposing him chained in a public square or at the whipping post, slave owners did not punish only that individual, but sent a clear message to all others. Iron awaited them if they dared to defy. It was a spectacle of intimidation, a pedagogy of cruelty. And yet, Even under the weight of chains, many still dreamed of freedom. Rebellions, escapes to quilombos, and acts of resistance showed that no matter how heavy the iron, the human spirit would not be imprisoned so easily. Chains also carried symbolic meaning. They represented the attempt to imprison entire cultures, to silence voices and erase memories. Each link was like a chain binding the African past to the oppressive colonial present. But at the same time, each scar opened by the iron became a living testimony, reminding future generations of the violence endured. The iron rusted, but memory remained. We cannot forget that chains were among the first instruments used from the moment of capture in Africa until arrival in the Americas. From imprisonment in African ports to the long marches toward slave ships, shackles already announced a life of captivity. During the passage of death, many preferred to die rather than live chained. There are reports of enslaved people throwing themselves into the sea, still with chains on their feet, choosing the deep waters as the last refuge of freedom. The chain that was supposed to imprison became, paradoxically, the final link with the will to decide one's own destiny. In Brazil, the last country in the West to abolish slavery, chains remained present until the final days of captivity. Until the year 1888, thousands of men and women still carried on their bodies the marks of iron. And even after abolition, the chains did not completely disappear. They remained as symbols of oppression, reflected in structural racism and social inequalities that still echo from slavery. The iron that once bound physically continues in other forms to try to imprison spiritually and socially. The chains were, without a doubt, one of the most striking instruments of slavery. They not only restricted bodies, but also represented the weight of humiliation, violence, and the attempt at domination. But they also revealed resistance. Each escape, each rebellion, each quilombo founded was proof that even under iron, the human spirit fought for freedom. And if chains attempted to hold life, there were other instruments destined for something even more cruel, tearing flesh and exposing blood before everyone. And that is exactly what we will speak about next. If chains were the silent symbol of slavery, iron hooks represented the cruel spectacle of exposed pain. These instruments were not designed only to restrain, but to tear, lacerate, and transform the body of the enslaved into a stage of public humiliation. The hooks were made of raw iron, with sharp tips that pierced the skin, pulling flesh, opening wounds, and leaving deep scars. In many cases, they were driven into the back or shoulders, from where overseers pulled enslaved people as if they were captured animals. Iron mixed with blood, and the groan of pain echoed as a warning to all others. Disobedience had a price in living flesh. These hooks were used in different situations. Many masters used them as punishment against those who tried to escape or rebel against the system. Others, more sadistic, made a point of displaying the suffering, dragging bodies through streets or plantation yards in front of other enslaved people so that it would serve as an example. It was a pedagogy of cruelty, not just to punish, but to turn pain into spectacle. At the whipping post, before the community, the enslaved person wounded by hooks was displayed as a trophy of colonial violence. The physical pain was indescribable. The cold iron pierced the flesh and, when pulled, tore muscles and tissues, leaving open wounds that rarely healed. Many times, infection was inevitable. Without adequate medical care, these wounds became the gateway to diseases that led to a slow and painful death. Blood dripped through torn clothes, staining the ground of slave quarters and plantations. The smell of rusty iron, mixed with human blood, became a permanent reminder of cruelty. But beyond physical violence, there was also a psychological dimension. Being dragged by hooks meant being exposed to shame, reduced to less than human. It was transforming the body into an object of spectacle. Overseers and slave owners, by using these instruments, reinforced the idea of absolute power. Whoever controlled the iron controlled life. The enslaved person ceased to be seen as a person and was treated as mere flesh, a body available to be torn apart. This dehumanization was central to the functioning of the slave system. There are historical accounts of hooks being placed even in the mouths of enslaved people, tearing lips and cheeks as a way of silencing and at the same time exposing pain. Others were used on ankles or backs to drag people back into captivity. The scene was so brutal that even some contemporaries of the time, defenders of slavery, were shocked by the level of cruelty. It was a violence that sought not only to punish, but to completely destroy human dignity. And yet, the hooks did not extinguish the flame of resistance. Many enslaved people preferred to risk their lives rather than submit again to captivity. They fled to quilombos, risked crossing the forests or faced punishment head-on, crying out for freedom. Each wound opened by the hooks also became a mark of courage, a silent testimony that the struggle could not be torn from the flesh. Iron wounded, but it could not erase the spirit of resistance. The hooks were also symbols of social power. The more cruel the punishment, the more the master affirmed his authority before the community. In squares, in streets, or on plantations, public violence was a way of consolidating control over hundreds of enslaved men and women. By watching a companion be torn apart, all the others were reminded of their condition of submission. It was collective control, achieved through individual pain. But at the same time that these instruments sought to destroy, they ended up revealing to the world the degree of brutality of slavery. Writers, travelers, and abolitionists denounced the practice of hooks as one of the most forceful proofs of the barbarity of the slave system. The spilled blood became an argument against those who defended the idea that slavery was necessary or natural. The body marked by iron turned into a living document of oppression. Today, when we remember the hooks used against the enslaved, we are not speaking only of iron objects, but of an ideology that tried to turn people into things. We are speaking of scars that cross generations and that still echo in collective memory. The hook did not only tear flesh, it sought to tear humanity itself. But even in the face of extreme pain, many stood up, resisted, and sought freedom, showing that the human spirit was stronger than iron. If hooks represented exposed pain and blood spilled in public, there was another instrument that terrified because it killed slowly in silence, without the need to cut flesh. This was the wooden stock, the prison where thirst and hunger became weapons as cruel as iron. If hooks tore flesh and exposed blood, the stock was the weapon of silence, a seemingly simple wooden prison, but one that turned into one of the most feared punishments of slavery. The stock consisted of a structure made of heavy wood, where the enslaved person was immobilized by the feet, hands, or neck. The victim remained trapped, unable to move, exposed to sun, rain, hunger, and above all, thirst. It was a torment that needed neither whips nor hooks, only time. The body itself, little by little, surrendered to suffering. The stock was used on farms, in sugar mills, and even in public areas such as whipping posts. The enslaved person was placed there as both punishment and collective intimidation. For hours, days, or even weeks, they remained exposed, without any relief. The wood pressed against the limbs, causing excruciating pain, swelling and open wounds. Legs lost circulation, muscles trembled, and breathing became increasingly difficult. The suffering was not only physical. Public shame was part of the punishment. Men, women, and even children were exposed, treated as spectacle before overseers and masters. The greatest cruelty came from thirst. Historical reports indicate that many enslaved people begged for a sip of water while locked in the stock, but instead of help, they received laughter and contempt. The sound of pleas mixed with the scorching heat, and each second became an eternity. Many did not survive. They dehydrated to death slowly before the eyes of all. The stock did not need to spill blood to kill. It killed in silence, corroding life from the inside out. Inside the slave quarters, the stock was also used as a form of control. The mere threat of being placed there was enough to spread fear. The enslaved knew that once confined in that structure, they might emerge permanently scarred or never emerge alive. It was a prolonged punishment, calculated to break the will to resist. While the whip injured in seconds, the stock injured over days. It was the torture of waiting, time itself as an instrument of death. The symbolism of the stock was even deeper. By immobilizing the body, it symbolized the imprisonment of life, the cutting off of freedom. The enslaved person ceased to be the subject of their own existence and became an exposed object, condemned to immobility. The heavy wood, reinforced with iron, reminded them that there was no way out, that the force of captivity lay in every detail. The stock was not only a physical punishment, it was a permanent reminder of submission. And yet, even in the face of cruelty, there was resistance. Many who survived the stock carried in their stories the testimony of pain, but also of courage. They became symbols of resilience, reminding us that despite the attempts at dehumanization, the human spirit resisted. In some regions, the enslaved themselves transformed the marks of the stock into narratives of denunciation, sharing stories so that the memory of violence would not be erased. Reports about the stock caught the attention even of European observers, who were horrified by the brutality of the practice. Writers and travelers described the instrument as one of the worst forms of torture, revealing to the world the level of inhumanity to which the enslaved were subjected. For many, the stock was more feared than the whip or the whipping post because there was no spectacle of blood, but a slow, invisible, and devastating death. The stock also became, over time, a symbol of the memory of slavery in Brazil. In some cities, similar structures were preserved as testimony to the cruelty of the system. To look at them today is to face history in its darkest form, remembering that freedom cost the suffering of thousands of men and women. Each splinter of wood carries the memory of tears and pleas for help that echoed in vain. If chains and hooks represented the brute force of iron and the stock showed the power of immobility and thirst, there were still other instruments that acted silently and psychologically, turning the enslaved into prisoners of their own bodies. These were the iron masks and collars, punishments that prevented even the right to speak or breathe freely. Among all the instruments of punishment in slavery, few were as humiliating as the iron masks and collars. Unlike the whip or the stock, which punished the body explicitly, these instruments struck mainly at dignity. The iron mask was placed over the face of the enslaved, covering the mouth and often also the nose, making breathing difficult and preventing speech. The collar was a heavy iron ring fastened around the neck, with chains or rods that immobilized movement. Both turned men and women into prisoners of themselves, deprived even of the possibility of expressing pain. The masks had varied shapes, but they all shared the same intention: to silence. They were imposed on enslaved people accused of talking too much, defying orders, or even trying to eat something in secret. By covering the mouth, the mask prevented the simple act of communicating, isolating the person in forced silence. Imagine living for days, weeks, or even months without being able to utter a word, forced to carry on your face an iron structure that pressed into the skin and wounded the lips. Silence, which could have been a choice of resistance, there was transformed into prison. The humiliation was even greater because the mask did not serve only to punish, it also exposed. Many were forced to walk around with their faces covered by iron before the community, as if they carried a mark of shame. The goal was clear: to reduce the enslaved person to a symbol of forced obedience, to show the others that there was no room for rebellion. The iron that silenced the mouth also silenced the soul. It was violence not only against the body, but against identity itself. The iron collars, in turn, were even heavier. Fastened to the neck, they often had iron rods that projected upward or to the sides, preventing the person from lying down or leaning against anything. This meant that the enslaved person spent days without being able to rest properly, forced to keep the head lifted and the body in an uncomfortable position. The pain in the neck and shoulders became unbearable, and the marks left by the iron were often permanent. These collars were used mainly against enslaved people accused of trying to escape. By locking the neck with heavy iron, overseers made any attempt at flight nearly impossible. The rods that stuck out to the sides also made it difficult to pass through doors or windows, turning the body into its own prison. The enslaved person became a walking prisoner, carrying on the neck the weight of submission. The psychological impact of these instruments was devastating. If the whip left scars on the body, the masks and collars left scars on the mind. Being deprived of the right to speak, to rest, to move freely was a profound form of dehumanization. It was as if the message were clear: you are not the owner of your own body, nor of your voice, nor of your rest. Iron replaced freedom, turning daily life into permanent torture. And yet, there are reports that many enslaved people transformed forced silence into silent resistance. Even deprived of speech, they maintained communication through glances, gestures, and signs. The body, though oppressed, found ways to express itself. Oppression tried to silence, but resistance found ways to survive. This shows that even in the face of extreme cruelty, the human spirit searched for cracks to remain alive. The travelers and chroniclers who recorded slavery in Brazil and in other countries of the Americas were often struck by the brutality of these instruments. Many reported that the masks and collars were inhuman punishments that caused unnecessary suffering. These accounts were fundamental to abolitionist movements, as they showed the world that slavery was not only forced labor, but also continuous torture and degradation of human dignity. Today, when we look at the images of these masks and collars preserved in museums, it is impossible not to feel a tightening in the chest. Each piece of iron carries within it the memory of a life marked by pain and humiliation. They are not only objects of the past, but silent witnesses that remind us of the brutality of slavery. At the same time, they are symbols of the resistance of those who, even silenced, never ceased to exist, never ceased to fight. If masks and collars imprisoned the voice and the body in a constant way, there was still one instrument that wounded in an immediate and bloody manner: the whip. The sound of the lash cutting through the air was the announcement of pain, one of the most well-known and feared symbols of slavery, and it is about that which we will speak next. If chains imprisoned, hooks tore, and collars silenced, the whip was the sound that announced pain. The crack of the lash cutting the air became, throughout the centuries of slavery, the most immediate symbol of violence. The whip did not need to be in constant motion. Many times, its mere presence, hanging in the hand of an overseer or resting in a corner of the slave quarters, was already enough to impose obedience. The fear of the lashing was as powerful as the lashing itself, and that was the main function of the whip, to discipline through terror. There were different types of whips used in captivity. The most common was the lash, made of rawhide, thick and heavy, capable of opening deep cuts in the skin with just one strike. There was also the bacalao, made of multiple strips, each reinforced with pieces of metal or bone, which tore the body of the enslaved even more. Another model was the latigo, long and flexible, used not only on plantations but also on slave ships to control Africans during the crossing of the Atlantic. Each variation of the whip had the same intention: to provoke intense pain, to leave scars, and to serve as an example. Punishments with the whip were public. At the whipping post before the community, enslaved people were tied to stocks or columns and received dozens or even hundreds of lashes. The backs opened into wounds, blood poured, and often flesh was left exposed. With each strike, the crowd was forced to watch, learning through the pain of others what would be the fate of anyone who defied the system. The whipping post became not only a place of punishment, but a theater of cruelty, where the whip was the main actor. The physical impact was devastating. Beyond the immediate pain, the lashes left permanent scars, known as quilhas, that marked the skin forever. Many enslaved people were left with deformed backs, with keloids that bore witness to the violence endured. The open wounds easily became infected, causing fevers and, in some cases, death. The whip did not only punish, it mutilated. But the violence did not stop with the body. The sound of the lash was also a psychological instrument. The simple crack in the air could paralyze an entire group, reminding them of their condition of submission. With each strike, the message was clear: the life of the enslaved was in the hands of the master or overseer. The lash was the extension of power, a way to transform obedience into a reflex conditioned by fear. Many travelers and chroniclers who passed through Brazil and other slaveholding regions recorded their indignation at witnessing punishments with the whip. They described the blood flowing in public squares, the flesh torn apart, the exhausted body collapsing after dozens of blows. For them, it was impossible to reconcile such violence with any justification of order, religion, or economy. The whip denounced without words the barbarity of the slave system. Even so, the whip also became a symbol of resistance. Many enslaved people, even after being lashed, continued to plan escapes, to form quilombos, to fight for their freedom. Each mark left on the skin turned into a living memory of violence and at the same time into fuel for the desire to break the chains. The whip could wound, but it could not erase the dream of freedom. In Brazil, which was the last country in the West to abolish slavery in the year 1888, the whip continued to be used until the very last days of captivity. Even when laws began to limit punishments, in practice, lashings remained a tool of control. The sound of the lash accompanied generations of men and women, becoming one of the most traumatic memories of slavery. Today, when we look at the marks preserved in accounts and images, we understand that the whip was not only an instrument of pain, but also a symbol of the attempt at dehumanization. It sought to reduce the human being to an obedient body marked by fear. But ironically, those same marks turned into living proof of resistance and of the cruelty of the system. Each scar is a testimony that echoes to this very day. If the whip represented immediate and visible pain, there were still other iron instruments that prolonged suffering in a constant and silent way. Shackles and eternal irons imprisoned the body day and night, preventing even dreams of freedom. And it is about them that we will speak in the next chapter. If the whip wounded in an instant, leaving the body bleeding, shackles and irons were punishments that stretched on day and night. They did not need cracks in the air nor open wounds to remind the enslaved of their condition. The heavy iron did that at every step, with every attempt at movement. Shackles on the wrists, irons on the ankles, chains that bound dozens of people together. These instruments were not created for quick punishment, but to turn daily life into a constant prison where even rest was impossible. The shackles were made of solid iron, molded to fit the wrists. Many times they were so tight that blood circulation was cut off, causing swelling and wounds. Prolonged contact with the metal produced cuts that turned into permanent scars. The irons on the ankles worked the same way, but had extra weight that made walking difficult. The simple act of taking a few steps became extreme effort. Over long distances, legs bled, muscles burned, and the body became enslaved not only to the master, but also to the iron itself. During the Atlantic slave trade, irons were a constant presence. On slave ships, hundreds of Africans were chained side by side, unable to move. Many spent weeks shackled by their ankles, enduring heat, thirst, and disease in unbearable conditions. The passage of death was marked by the sound of chains dragging in the ship's hold, mixed with cries and groans. Those who did not survive were thrown into the sea, still in chains, and the irons dragged them to the depths of the ocean. In this case, iron not only imprisoned, it also condemned to death. In the slave quarters, irons were used as a form of control and intimidation. Enslaved people considered rebellious or suspected of planning escapes were forced to sleep chained, often tied to one another. This meant that even rest became torture. The cold iron cut into the skin, the chain pulled with the slightest movement, and the constant weight kept the body from relaxing. The result was chronic fatigue, physical and mental exhaustion that eroded resistance over time. The symbolism of shackles and irons was profound. They represented the attempt to erase any possibility of freedom. While the whip marked the skin with immediate pain, the chains marked the soul with the constant reminder that every gesture, every step was under control. The enslaved person was not even the owner of his or her own movements. Even the simple act of walking required the permission of iron. But iron, as heavy as it was, could not erase hope. Many enslaved people, even in chains, found ways to resist. There are reports of escapes in which men and women fled still with irons on their feet, running through the forest with the metallic sound betraying their presence. Some quilombos received fugitives who arrived with the marks of chains on their ankles, symbols of courage and determination. The iron that was supposed to imprison turned into testimony of resistance. The psychological impact was devastating. To be chained for days or weeks was to live in constant reminder that one was considered property. The body did not belong to the individual, but to the system that imprisoned it. That sense of dehumanization was perhaps the greatest purpose of shackles and irons, to reduce the human being to the condition of an object, tamed not only by forced labor, but also by the unrelenting weight of iron. Even after the abolition of slavery in Brazil in the year 1888, many irons were preserved and became symbols of the violence of the past. Today, they are displayed in museums and cultural centers, not as objects of forgetting, but as silent witnesses of the cruelty suffered by millions of people. To look at these instruments is to remember that freedom was not won for free, but at the cost of much blood, sweat, and suffering. If shackles and irons represented the constant and silent imprisonment of the body, there were also instruments created to deform posture and humiliate even more. The wooden forks and iron collars were punishments that turned every gesture into pain and every movement into submission. And it is precisely about them that we will speak next. If shackles and irons already turned life into constant captivity, the wooden forks and iron collars took humiliation and pain to another level. These instruments were designed not only to imprison, but to transform the body into a visible prison, exposing the person to ridicule and continuous suffering. The fork was made of two wooden or iron rods in the shape of a V, which locked the neck and hands of the enslaved person, forcing them to keep their arms raised and the body in an uncomfortable position. The iron collars, on the other hand, were heavy rings placed around the neck, often with sharp spikes or rods that projected outward, making any movement difficult. The fork was used mainly on enslaved people considered rebellious or insubordinate. The weight of the structure forced the person to walk with difficulty, always exposed to the gaze of others. It was like carrying a forced cross, which not only caused physical pain, but also exposed shame publicly. The enslaved person could not eat easily, could not defend themselves, and was often forced to work even while locked in the fork. Every movement was accompanied by the friction of wood or iron against the skin, causing wounds that turned into permanent scars. The iron collars served a similar function. Some were simple heavy rings, but others were created to intensify suffering. There were collars with spikes pointing inward, which wounded the neck at every movement. Others had rods that extended upward or to the sides, preventing the enslaved person from lying down or passing through narrow doors. It was a punishment that stretched on day and night, reminding the individual of their condition of submission. Rest was impossible, the body was always on alert, and pain was constant. These instruments also served as a form of surveillance. By placing collars with bells or pieces of iron attached, overseers could hear the movements of the enslaved even from a distance. In this way, any attempt to escape was easily discovered. The body itself became a betrayer, carrying the sound of imprisonment. It was a cruel form of control in which freedom became even more unattainable. The psychological dimension of this type of punishment was devastating. The enslaved person was turned into a spectacle, exposed to the mockery of others and the indifference of masters. To carry an iron collar on the neck or a fork on the arms was also to carry the mark of a system that sought to reduce human beings to mere objects of obedience. Humiliation became as heavy as the iron itself. Even so, the forks and collars could not erase the desire for freedom. Many enslaved people, even bound in these instruments, tried to escape or resist. There are reports of men and women who endured days of suffering without surrendering, showing that no matter how heavy the iron was, the human spirit still found strength to fight. This silent resistance was essential to keep the flame of freedom alive in the midst of oppression. Travelers and abolitionists who witnessed the use of these instruments denounced their cruelty, describing them as practices that went beyond the limits of human brutality. Images of enslaved people carrying forks or iron collars circulated in accounts and engravings, becoming visible proof of the violence of slavery. These records helped mobilize public opinion against the slave system, showing the world that it was not only forced labor, but also constant torture. Today, when we see some of these instruments preserved in museums, it is impossible not to imagine the physical and emotional weight they carried. They remind us that slavery was not only a chapter of economic exploitation, but a machine of humiliation and daily suffering. Each fork, each iron collar is a testimony of cruelty and resistance that mark this history. If forks and iron collars imprisoned the body and humiliated dignity, there were still instruments destined for something even more extreme: the mutilation of the human body as a form of punishment and intimidation. Knives, blades, and saws were used to mark, amputate, and destroy, and it is about these instruments of mutilation that we will speak in the next chapter. Among all punishments applied in slavery, few were as terrifying as the instruments of mutilation. If chains imprisoned, whips wounded, and collars humiliated, knives, blades, and saws had as their main goal to destroy the body irreversibly. It was not only a passing punishment, it was the definitive mark of submission, a reminder carved into flesh that the enslaved person had no control over their own life. Mutilation was one of the most extreme methods of punishment, used against those who tried to escape, rebelled, or simply defied the will of the masters. Amputations were common. Hands and feet were cut off to prevent future escapes or rebellions. The enslaved person who dared to challenge the system began to carry on the body, a warning to all others. Freedom came at a high price. In some regions, it was common practice to cut off ears or mark the face with burning blades to identify those who had tried to escape. These visible marks turned the person into a public example of punishment, while at the same time condemning them to live with stigmas that set them apart from afar. The use of sharp blades and saws was not limited to punishing fugitives. In many cases, it was also a form of collective intimidation. It was enough for one enslaved person to be mutilated in a public square for all others to understand the message. The whipping post became once again a stage of pain. Torn flesh, blood dripping before the eyes of dozens of men and women was the most cruel way to reaffirm the absolute power of the system. Mutilations also had a symbolic character. By cutting hands, feet, or ears, slave masters sought not only to prevent escapes, but also to reduce the enslaved person to the condition of incomplete, of someone who could never again be seen as whole. It was a direct attack on humanity. The body, which should have been a space of identity and dignity, was turned into proof of domination. Each scar, each missing limb was a reminder of institutionalized violence. The physical pain was indescribable. Without anesthesia, without adequate medical care, the enslaved were mutilated brutally. Infections were common, leading many to death days after punishment. Those who survived faced a life of continuous suffering, limited in their abilities and constantly reminded of the torment they had endured. The body became a prison, and every movement revealed the absence of a part torn away by cruelty. Mutilation also profoundly affected the mind. To live without hands, without feet, with deep marks on the face or body meant carrying an identity imposed by violence. The enslaved person could not hide. Their pain was public. Their scar was a sentence. This fed the sense of powerlessness, but also awakened collective awareness that slavery was capable of surpassing every limit of cruelty. Even so, mutilation could not erase resistance. Many mutilated enslaved people continued to fight, to live, and even to escape. Some were welcomed into quilombos, where they became living symbols of courage. Their marks ceased to be only signs of submission and came to be seen as testimony of the brutality that needed to be confronted. In their scars, there was also strength to inspire others not to give up, even in the face of terror. The presence of these instruments of mutilation shocked even some contemporaries of the time. Accounts of travelers and missionaries described scenes of horror, denouncing the use of blades and saws against the enslaved. These descriptions circulated among abolitionists and were used as proof that slavery was not only economic exploitation, but also systematic torture. The marked body became an argument against the system. Today, to think of the instruments of mutilation used during slavery is to face one of the darkest aspects of this history. Knives, saws, and blades, which in other contexts could mean work and production, were transformed into tools of pain and humiliation. In every cut, there was a message, the attempt to annul freedom. But in every survivor, there was also resistance, reminding us that even in the face of horror, the human spirit could not be completely destroyed. If the instruments of mutilation left permanent marks on the body, there was still a setting that turned pain into public spectacle, the whipping post. There, before the community, the whip, chains, and even mutilations were displayed as theater of submission. And it is about this stage of cruelty that we will speak in the next chapter. Among all the settings of slavery, none symbolize collective humiliation as much as the whipping post. Located in the center of towns, in squares or open spaces, the whipping post was a column of wood or stone where enslaved people were tied to receive punishments before the community. More than just a place of punishment, it was a public theater of cruelty, where pain was turned into spectacle and shame spread as a lesson. There, chains, whips, iron collars, and even mutilations were applied under the watchful eyes of masters, overseers, and passers-by. The goal was not only to punish the body of one individual, but to reinforce the submission of all. The whipping post existed in various cities in Brazil and throughout the Americas. In colonial towns, its presence was mandatory, as it represented the authority of local power. It was there that colonial justice materialized. Enslaved people who tried to escape, who stole, or who simply disobeyed were taken to be punished publicly. The urban space, which should have been a symbol of coexistence and community, was transformed into a stage of torture. Every square with a whipping post was a constant reminder that slavery was at the heart of social life. The punishments applied at the whipping post varied in intensity, but the whip was the main actor. Tied to the column, the enslaved person received dozens or even hundreds of lashes, which tore the back until blood flowed. In some cases, in addition to whips, iron masks or heavy collars were applied during the exposure, prolonging humiliation. The body became a spectacle of pain, and the audience learned by example. The whipping post was more than punishment. It was pedagogy of violence. The psychological function of this space was clear. By gathering the community to watch torture, masters reinforced collective fear. Each blow did not only strike the victim, but all the enslaved who watched, reminding them of the destiny reserved for those who dared to resist. The whipping post, therefore, was an instrument of social control. Its central location ensured that no one could ignore the scene. Violence was part of daily urban life, normalized in everyone's eyes. For the enslaved, the whipping post represented the highest level of humiliation. It meant being exposed before men, women, and children, treated as an example of disobedience. Public shame was added to physical pain, making the punishment even more cruel. It was not only the body that was wounded, but also honor and identity. The community saw, commented, and remembered. The whipping post eternalized pain in collective memory. Despite its oppressive function, the whipping post was also a space of symbolic resistance. Many enslaved people, even in the face of public torture, kept their gaze firm, refusing to cry or show submission. Others, while being punished, shouted words of revolt, turning the stage of pain into a stage of denunciation. Each act of courage at the whipping post was a reminder that oppression never fully managed to eliminate the desire for freedom. Foreign travelers who passed through Brazil during the colonial period were often shocked by the scenes witnessed at whipping posts. Their accounts, filled with indignation, circulated in books and newspapers, helping to strengthen abolitionist movements. For them, the whipping post was the most visible proof of the brutality of slavery. Violence was not hidden, but displayed with pride, as if it were part of the social order. These denunciations helped dismantle the idea that slavery was only forced labor, revealing its true face of institutionalized terror. Today, many whipping posts still exist, preserved as part of historical memory. In cities such as Salvador, Ouro Preto, and Olinda, these columns still stand, no longer as instruments of punishment, but as silent witnesses of a past that cannot be forgotten. For some, walking past a whipping post is to feel the presence of voices silenced there, to hear in the silence of the stones the echo of screams that marked centuries of oppression. These monuments remind us that slavery was not only a distant shadow, but a reality that shaped Brazil and left deep scars on society. If the whipping post was the public stage of pain, where humiliation was displayed to all, there were also the invisible marks left in the memory of the enslaved and their descendants. Iron, blood, and violence did not disappear with the end of slavery. They transformed into memories that crossed generations. And it is about this weight of memory, about the marks of iron and blood that remained, that we will speak in the next chapter. Chains, hooks, the wooden stock, collars, whips, and the whipping post did not remain only in the past. They live on in collective memory, as symbols of the suffering and resistance of the enslaved. Each instrument, each piece of iron, each mark of blood is a testimony of the cruelty that sustained centuries of slavery in Brazil and in so many other parts of the world. Even when iron rusted and wood decayed, the scars remained, not only on bodies, but in the history of an entire people. These marks of iron and blood were transmitted from generation to generation. The memory of slavery did not disappear with the signing of the Golden Law in the year 1888. On the contrary, it infiltrated the social, cultural, and psychological structures of Brazil. Structural racism, social inequality, and the marginalization of the black population are direct inheritances of that system. It is as if the chains had been physically removed, but remained invisibly present, limiting opportunities and perpetuating exclusion. The descendants of enslaved people carry in their stories the memories of pain and resistance of their ancestors. Each scar left by the whip, each life taken by the wooden stock, each escape interrupted by irons, was transformed into a narrative of struggle. Quilombos, revolts, songs, and rituals were ways of keeping alive the flame of freedom in the midst of the darkness of oppression. That inheritance is not only one of suffering, but also of courage, dignity, and resilience. The memory of slavery is also present in physical spaces. Museums, preserved whipping posts, ruins of slave quarters and sugar mills have become places of remembrance and reflection. To look at an iron collar displayed in a glass case is to feel the weight of humiliation that so many endured. To walk past a whipping post is to hear, in the silence of the stones, the echo of screams that marked history. These spaces are essential so that memory is not forgotten, and so that new generations understand the depth of slaveholding violence. However, remembering is not only about looking back, it is also about looking at the present and realizing that many chains have still not been broken. Racial prejudice, police violence, economic exclusion, and social invisibility continue to be forms of imprisonment. The blood shed in past centuries still cries out for justice today. This historical continuity obliges us to transform memory into action, to use the past as a guide to build a more just future. The iron and blood of slavery also generated culture and resistance. In Afro-Brazilian music, dances, religions, and traditions, we see the strength of a people who refuse to be erased. The beat of drums, the preserved words of African languages, the rites of candomblé and umbanda, samba and capoeira are living expressions of resistance against slavery. Each cultural gesture is a way of shouting freedom, even after centuries of oppression. It is important to remember that the memory of slavery does not belong only to the victims, but to all of society. It reveals the cruelest side of humanity, but it also shows us the capacity for resistance in the face of pain. To remember is to take responsibility, to recognize that suffering existed and that its consequences still echo. The memory of iron and blood is also a call for no one to remain silent in the face of current injustices. The scars of slavery invite us to reflect on who we are today. Brazil, marked by having been the last country in the West to abolish slavery, still faces the consequences of this historical delay. Understanding the weight of these memories is essential to build a society that truly values freedom, equality, and human dignity. The iron that once imprisoned must be transformed into a symbol of struggle, and the blood that was shed must become a seed of justice. If each instrument of punishment spoke of pain, together they also tell a story of resistance. The memory of iron and blood is not only about slavery, but about survival, about the strength of a people who refuse to be destroyed. And it is precisely this memory that brings us to the conclusion of this journey, where we will reflect on the importance of never allowing the past to be forgotten, and of transforming the remembrance of pain into a commitment to freedom. Chains, hooks, the wooden stock, iron collars, whips, irons, and the whipping post were not only instruments of punishment in slavery, they were weapons of control, tools of humiliation, and marks of blood that crossed generations. Each rusted piece of iron, each worn piece of wood, each scar left on the skin of the enslaved carries within it the memory of a violence that sought to reduce human beings to objects. But it also carries the remembrance of resistance, of strength, and of the dignity of millions who fought, even in the face of pain. Brazil, which alone received nearly 5 million enslaved Africans and was the last country in the West to abolish slavery, still bears in the present the marks of that past. Structural racism, social inequality, and exclusion continue to be invisible chains that must be broken every single day. To remember the most cruel instruments of punishment is not to reopen old wounds. It is to prevent them from closing without healing. It is to keep alive the awareness that freedom was won with blood, tears, and resistance. Iron tried to imprison bodies, but it could not imprison the human spirit. Blood was shed, but it was also transformed into seeds of culture, struggle, and identity. Today it is up to us to carry this memory not as a burden, but as a responsibility. Responsibility not to allow pain to be forgotten, to transform remembrance into learning and learning into action. If this video has impacted you, subscribe to the channel, share this story, and help keep alive the memory that so many tried to erase. Because while iron rusted and wood decayed, the memory of those who suffered still cries out, asking never again to be silenced.